So, welcome all. We are fast approaching the end of day 2, so thanks for sticking with us. My name is Chris Coffin. I am on the MITRE CVE team. I introduced myself yesterday, but I'll go ahead and do it again for any folks that are new today. I've worked at MITRE and on the CVE program since 2012. And spent most of that time on the CVE program in various roles. I'm also a CVE board member, and you'll hear me talk about it a couple of times today. I'm a co-chair of the CVE Quality Working Group. And yeah, I'll cover that in more detail later. A lot of my recent efforts have been focused on the QWG and helping drive improvements within the CVE record format, which is our JSON schema. We've talked about quality and completeness and utility of CVE data, and this is, the CVE record format is key to that. As far as questions during my presentation, you're free to throw things in the chat. I will try to monitor that at the same time, although feel free to raise your hand or speak up if you've got a pressing question. So overview. I'll provide an overview of the record format just to make sure everybody understands what the CVE record format is. I'll give a glimpse of what we released in the 5.1.1 release, which is what is current. We also have some new features implemented for the 5.2.0 release, which is due to drop on October 29th. And then we'll cover some of the things that we've been discussing and that's on the horizon for future releases of the CVE record format. All right, so what is the CVE record format? The CVE record format is the JSON schema that can be used by CVE numbering authorities or CNAs, as well as ADPs, to describe a CVE record. It can also be used by tools to display and digest CVE records, and sometimes it can be read directly by us nerdy folks. The current version of the CVE record format is 5.1.1, and it contains a handful of required data properties, such as affected product and version, vulnerability type, public reference URLs, as well as many other optional data properties, which we'll cover a few today. So why should you care about the CVE record format? Well, so everyone in this room should care about it. It is the schema that determines what data can be provided by CNAs when they submit their records. So if there's a specific software identifiers are important, that you'd like to use and provide within a CVE record, the record format can be updated to provide that information. It also includes default requirements for data that must be included by CNAs. We currently require a handful of fields, including affected product, a public reference, and some sort of problem type, which we've talked about in the chat. If you have questions regarding whether something should be included within the record format, we're all ears. We'd definitely be interested in hearing about any suggestions for things that should or should not be required, as well as obviously new pieces of data that are important. I'll provide some links to our GitHub repo and info about how to join the QWG, which is where we hash some of this stuff out. I'll provide that later in the slide deck so that you guys can get more involved if you wish. Okay, so CVE record format 5.1.1 was released December of 2024. In that release, we began supporting common platform enumeration identifiers, or as many of you might be familiar, just CPE. Many in the community were seeing a new emerging need for CPE data at that time, and the CVE program updated the record format to include CPEs in 5.1.1. Specifically, we included a very close representation of the NVD CVE applicability details, the configurations. For those that are familiar with it, this meant that the CVE records could now include an optional array, which was separate from the affected array, which includes CP applicability statements. And so this could be dropped in as is. Essentially, you could go to the NVD records, pull out the data that was used at NVD and stuff it right into the CVE record, and it would work great. So that was the biggest update with 5.1.1. We added a few other minor things. I know we sort of took a stance on example CVE records, or we did take a stance, that we would use that namespace as CVE-1900 and then whatever sequence number you wanted, just so that there wouldn't be conflicts when using examples in documentation regarding CVE. I think we probably still have a few things to clean up on our own website for that reason. But basically, we didn't want to let people just stomp on existing CVEs. So make a namespace that obviously isn't used. So just to give a quick brief and an example, as mentioned on the previous slide, this shows a CVE JSON where a single product version is affected. Both the affected array as well as the CP applicability array are provided to kind of show you how they could be used side by side. CPEs are obviously optional. They can be provided if you want. They're not required. There are a few CNAs providing this data today. This is not something that a lot of producers of CVE records have used up to this point, but it is still fairly new. So we'll probably, hopefully, see more use of this going forward. So 5.2.0. The big update for this is another software identifier. We are adding support for Perl strings. So this is probably the most significant update for 5.2.0. Outside of that, we're also I'll cover Perl a little bit more in a second. We're also tightening the schema. The affected array now will disallow additional properties. We did have a number of cases where property names were misspelled or additional properties were being added. So the best thing to do for now was to disallow additional properties within the affected array. And then what else? Because of the Perl edition, we also updated some of our example JSON files in the repo and made a few additional improvements based on some prior GitHub issues. We've got a backlog of GitHub issues that we're working through, and there's probably going to be a number of those that you'll see that obviously in this case are not related to Perl at all, but things that we think needed to be taken care of. Included some build file improvements. So if you're interested, and like I said, I'll give you a link to our GitHub repo later in the deck. This gives you an idea of some of the specific issues that we worked on, and we're not going to go through all these here. But you can see that the one at the top, tightening up the schema, number 259, does line up with one of the things I just mentioned. What do we have going on in the chat? Anything I should address? Anybody have any questions at this point? Comments, thoughts? Just want to make sure everybody's heard. All right, cool. I'll just keep going. So what is Perl? I'm sure many of you know what Perl is, and we even talked about it yesterday quite a bit, but I'll just give you some quick briefs. Perl is a software identifier standard that uses a URL string to identify software packages. Excuse me, in a mostly universal and uniform way across many different things, such as programming languages, package managers, package conventions, tools, APIs, and databases. And that list would also include OSs, obviously. If you're familiar with CPE, Perl is also a software identifier, like I mentioned, but with a different syntax. Another difference is that CPE was defined with the intent to capture all types of software, whereas Perl is mainly intended to capture packages. So think of like RPMs, NPMs, that sort of thing. And so in that case as well, you'll find that a lot of open source tools and obviously packages would be covered by Perl. I think it was also mentioned yesterday, I think I brought it up, that there have been some recent discussions that I've heard, at least in a presentation from one of the founders of Perl, that they're looking to expand some of that scope in the future. So you may see Perl cover other things and have other namespaces beyond just packages. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But basically for Perl, some of you might be wondering why bother, because we already have product and version specified, and even CPE. So we've got a lot of ways to define product and version. I think for Perl and for CPE as well, what we're seeing is, we're providing a more machine readable way of defining products that can be used by tools, as opposed to someone having to pull all this data out and manually, understand it as a human. So I think both are important. But I will say Perl right now is definitely, again, optional. It is not required by producers of the data. But I think it will become important, and I think a lot of people will use it. And just to, actually, no, I'll save that. So on this slide, I did provide some syntax, or the syntax for a Perl string, a few examples of how that might be used. Note the version, because we'll talk about that in a second. This is examples taken from the Perl spec itself. And then if you do want more info, I gave the link at the very bottom to the Perl spec itself. So you can visit that if you wish. All right, so Perl in the record format. So how do we define it? This is simply one additional property at this point. But there is one addition to that I'll talk about, which is the version. The CVE record format now includes the optional package URL property within the affected array, where the Perl string can be provided along with the other affected product and version information. Again, note that it is optional. So a few other important notes and guidelines about using Perl and the package URL property in a CVE record. CVE services, which is how many of you will be submitting this data, or probably all of you, will provide and enforce validation on the Perl syntax. So backing up, we had a discussion yesterday about quality and completeness and utility of CVE records. Well, quality and completeness are important. And I've heard, I guess, through the listening sessions as well, that valid or syntactically valid data is important. So that is something that we are focusing on now in the QWG. Perl specifically now with this addition it wasn't something where we could just do a regex within the schema and validate Perl syntax. It's not as simple as that. So CVE services has provided programmatic validation for the Perls, so that we make sure that what we're getting from a producer when they submit a CVE record is actually a valid Perl. Now, it won't be going out and checking if the package or thing specified by the Perl exists, although I think Perl themselves intend to provide tools that will do that down the road. I can't promise that that will be part of CVE services and its validation, but it's something to think about. The other thing I think Perl founders had mentioned is that they're looking at using an offline database as well, which could be useful for this purpose. But we'll see. I have to see how that plays out. But anyways, we're just checking syntax. We're not checking to see if the Perl actually points to something real. If it fails validation during submission of the CVE record, it'll get pushed back, and you'll have to make sure that you update the Perl accordingly to make sure that it is syntactically correct. The other thing I mentioned earlier is the version of the Perl string. So for now, we are not allowing the version to be provided with the Perl string. The reason for that is that it could conflict with what is already required to be provided in the version of the affected array. So the best thing to do at this point, at least the way it was defined now, as far as the QWG is concerned, is that we would not allow version to be provided in both places. So the Perl really is just a way to provide the product name in a machine readable way, as well as any of the other data properties like addition or actually, I'm confusing that with CPE, but some of the other parts of the Perl syntax. Any questions, comments? I know, let me go take a look at chat and make sure I'm not missing anything important. Looks like there's discussions going on.
Dromo says, shouldn't that be a list of package URLs? Is there a way to provide more than one?
So as far as I'm aware, you can provide multiple Perl strings there. That is an array. Andrew Lily Brinker, tell me if I'm wrong there. That's the intended way?
Sorry, yeah, it is not an array. This is actually what I was saying in the chat as well. Basically, if you want to have multiple package URLs, it's equivalent to what you would do today if you were trying to have multiple collection URL and package name entries, which are similarly existing identifiers that are plain strings. You would need to have multiple objects within the affected array that reflect the separate packages that are affected by the vulnerability. So basically, the way that you handle that with the package URL field is the same way that you would handle it with the existing identifiers, whether it's vendor and product or collection URL and package name, by having multiple entries in the affected array.
Tomo, it sounds like we need to have an offline discussion about that just to make sure we understand exactly what you're thinking. All right. We'll get back to that or continue to hash it out, and I'll take a look as well once we're finished. So there is an important Vulnogram compatibility consideration. I actually checked Vulnogram today, and it looks like it is accepting the data version. So with the release of 5.2.0, the data version within CVE records does get bumped to 5.2. In Vulnogram today, there is a check to make sure that the CVE record data version is a valid version. And it was looking for 5.0 and 5.1. So if you tried to load or open a file that was data version 5.2, it would fail and say that it wasn't a valid CVE JSON file. So that has been updated within the live instance of Vulnogram that many of you probably use. But if you have forked that code and do your own thing with it, have your own tool or your own instance, you need to update. I think in the original code it was line 526 to include 5.2.0 as the data version or an acceptable data version. Otherwise, you'll get a message in regards to that. Yeah, it was line 526 in script.js. So it's in the slides. We'll get these slides out after the meeting. All right. So what's on the horizon for 6.0.0? As for future updates, we have been discussing various ways of tightening up data validation. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there's many opportunities for us to include better validation of product and version data, such as obviously enforcing Perls, CPEs, the types of versions that are provided, such as SEMVer, which has been discussed quite a bit, and how what we accept for those versions. I don't know how close any of you are to the version types that we currently provide, but there's a few examples I think provided in Vulnogram, but none of those do any validation today. But we are looking to change that going forward. So version type will become important in the future, probably in 6.0.0. So if you're not paying attention to version type today, you definitely should, because that will start to matter once we implement more validation around those. There has also been talk about setting up a validation library separate from the schema, because not all validation, like with Perl, for instance, can be done through the schema itself. As well, the schema doesn't provide the best error messages. So doing it programmatically, I think, is the right way to go. How do we do that? And also let the community be part of that. I think we've talked about setting up a validation library that could be separated and could be used for your own tools before submitting CVE records. We haven't started anything on this. We've just kind of been working out some of the requirements and thinking about what this might turn into. So if you're interested in an effort like that, getting involved in it. That's another thing that the QWG will be tackling in the future. And we obviously need all the help we can get. So feel free. Last, there is a feature branch, and VJ covered this yesterday as well for stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization data. This is something that I think, VJ, you just recently updated as well. I don't know if VJ, if you're here or not, but there is a... Okay. So we probably don't need to cover like tons of detail on it, but I know that this is something that will also go into the next version of the record format as far as official support. If you guys have paid attention to the CISA ADP data, they do include SSVC data, but it's provided as a custom metric. It's not, we're not officially supporting SSVC in the record format, but with VJ's update, it will provide official support for SSVC. Last but not, go ahead.
All right, I just put the PR in there where we are having the RFD discussion. So we welcome any feedback, anybody who wants to. A lot of people have, John has given a lot of feedback, Jacobs has given feedback, but we would like more voices for sure.
Thank you, VJ. Another thing I think, and it's not on the slide here, that's come up a lot, and I've even seen it in the comments today, is removing data. And specifically, Jay Jacobs mentioned yesterday that the schema is complex. I think if I remember right, he gave me a count of the number of properties today, and it was like 160 in the current CVE record format. And not all of those are used, as we talked about. The other thing that I think he didn't mention is that there's a lot of redundant properties. And specifically, I'm pointing at CVSS, and it's not their fault, obviously. We basically took the CVSS schema as it exists from first and dropped that into the CVE record format. And the problem is that a lot of that data, you have all the different metrics separate in their own properties. You also have the vector string, and you also have the score. Well, we probably don't need all of those things. We can probably trim that down and free up or remove a lot of the extra properties that aren't needed in the schema and make it much less complex. I know CVSS is a fairly complex part of the schema today. I think we could definitely do a better job of removing that complexity and making the CVE record format much simpler. That's another thing I think that we need to tackle as far as the next major update of the schema. And yes, removing things is hard. So that's something that's gonna take some time. So I promised I'd give you guys a reference to the CVE record format GitHub repo. It is simply CVE-schema. There is a link provided there. We have a fairly active set of issues, discussions, and PRs. So please feel free to join. You don't have to be a QWG member to be part of the discussions and submit issues. So we'd love to hear from you if you have questions or comments or issues. And then the quality working group itself, we were established by the board for the purpose of enhancing the quality of CVE submissions. And I'll just give you an interesting point. The QWG has existed long before the schema or the CVE record format was created. So that is something that the QWG took on at some point, and it aligns well and is something that now is what much of our time is focused on. But yeah, if you're interested in joining, feel free to reach out directly. I put my email address on this slide, so you can reach out to me directly, or you can just use the working group signups that are listed on the website. Any questions or comments?
Can you remind us? I think Jonathan Chow has worked Vulnogram, so he's wondering what the date he has to update his version to allow for version 5.2.
This is Jonathan Chow, you said, who's updating Vulnogram?
It's in the chat.
Okay. When is the deadline that I need to update in order to work? Yeah, so it looks like it has been updated today. So I actually tried to load a 5.2.0 version today, and it looked like it worked in the main instance of Vulnogram. So I think we're good to go. Because right now, 5.2.0 is in the test environment. It's just for the production release, we're looking at October 29th on the CVE side. So does that answer your question, Jonathan?
No,
Yes.
sorry. No, actually, my question is, we are still using the 5.0.1, I believe. So
Okay.
if I continue to use this version to upload to the Vonogram, will I get an error message, or can I? Yeah, this is my question.
Okay. So you're
2
saying
minutes.
if you're, thanks, Alicia.
So basically, if I don't update to a 5.2, can I still use it to upload through the Vonogram? Like, will I get any error message?
So there could be some cases where we've tightened data, like say if you were to provide an affected array item that was inaccurate, like misspelled, that you could get some error messages in regards to things like that. But no, if you're not providing any of the new data fields, you should be fine. So I can't tell you for sure that you'll be totally perfect submitting 5.0.1. We do recommend that you always use the latest version of the schema on your side for your own tooling, but
Okay.
you should be okay because we haven't upgraded to a major version just yet.
Okay.
But when we do go to like 6.0.0, I will tell you for sure that it will likely include breaking changes to where you couldn't use 5.0.1 anymore.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions? We have 1 minute.
I just had one comment. How can we reduce the time for new CVE schema to end up in the CVE automation working group? Or we are considering something like a CI/CD pipeline to constantly be incrementally updating. That way, small features like this get integrated, and we're doing more things than just doing once or twice a year.
Yeah.
Or
Well, that's a good question, VJ. I think the other question there too is how often do producers and consumers want to see us update? And I think that's a question for the CWG, because I don't think we've ever really had a good solid answer on what's acceptable. I mean, if we're updating the schema every 3 months, quarterly, is that too much? How often should we be, releasing major versions? Is that okay to do a couple of times a year, or is that just a once a year kind of thing? So, and we also need to be careful not to overload the people using the schema. So I'd say it would be a great question for the CWG to figure out what they want, and then we'll move out from there.